Hear me anyway. Welcome to Doug George, who's here to tell us that we need our sediment to survive. A thesis hopefully you can support somehow is not that muddy. Anyway, so a lot of you know, well, I don't know, some of you know Doug from the days when he did his PhD here at BML, and but he's now a program manager at NOAA Office for Coastal Management. And Doug, and give a little introduction, but you feel free to add to it before we start your talk. Dickie, correct anything I say wrong, right? So Doug's work was on transport of sediment past headlands. And so first of all, what are the headlands along the coast, identifying the different headlands, different shapes, sizes, little ones and big ones, and trying to sort of, articulate what a headland even means. And then the second part was taking observations. That is kind of fun. Unfortunately, I missed a lot of it down at Point Doom, where it's warm, and the observations of currents and sediment transport past that headland, which is a critical question in the littoral cells of Santa Monica Bay, or different, the headlands have split these littoral cells of these sediment budgets. And then the third was a numerical modeling. And I remember the one output of the model looks very much like Muscle Point and Salmon Creek Beach. I'm still looking for the shoal out there, but I know people surf it when really big waves come through. So that was fun. But he's, Doug's done a lot of things, many diverse experiences and broad knowledge. So don't try and put him in a box. I mean, I guess you've always worked in sediment, but not narrowly, broadly into coastal habitats. And before PhD, I know that you have a master's in journalism from Columbia and a master's in oceanography from Dalhousie. So that gives you some idea of the breadth of activity and interest. You were at OPC for a while. You were, I think I actually wrote things down, but I knew I'd forget. You're at USGS, of course, and also worked as a consultant at ESA, Environmental Science and Associates, and APM, Applied, whatever they were. Yeah. So multifaceted, many experiences, and what I really enjoy about that is it gives one a broad view of whatever you're focusing on. So focus is cool, but you got to put it in context. Doug really does that excellently. After PhD, worked with the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary on sediment issues. Worked again with the state of California with the Resources Agency, California State Parks, and did a postdoc in HF radar work. Many other roles you play. I know you're very active board of directors, American Shore and Beach Preservation Association. But perhaps that's enough for now, because of course
definitely
you didn't come here to hear me. So you've got a mic on.
Yeah.
So it's up to you.
All right. Well, thank you, John. And I hope what you were hearing in all of that introduction was that lots of opportunities can come your way. Not that I couldn't keep a job. But no, I appreciate that, John. Just because, as a student, I was certainly interested in a lot of different things, and connecting the dots was always really an interest of mine, and going beyond foundational science, which is especially key, but also wanting to apply it to real world problems. So what I'm going to talk to you about over the next little bit really, I think, reflects that path, that it can be, you can start with one really interesting topic, but understanding, as John said, putting it in context really will make your science sing. So let's get to singing. So I always like to start with some big picture images, literally, and just sort of ask you to take a moment to observe this. As scientists, we're trained to be observationalists and start asking questions, and certainly grounding us in our coastal environment is key. So, the fun things that what I see when I look at our satellite images along our coastline here, those river plumes, all that amazing sediment coming out, and what's going to be coming with that sediment too. The San Francisco Bay, the plume coming out from the bay, and how that's traveling up and down the coast. And also just the heavy development and the lack of development and the different kinds of development, just in this few hundred miles of coastline. So a microcosm of anywhere in the world really can be explored just along our coastline. I don't need to tell you all that because you're here in this beautiful place and it happens to be sunny today for those of you who are watching us on Zoom. So I'll take you on a walk on the beach. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivations for studying sediment, what that means. Definitions are always really key. So what we do with that sediment in terms of how we can do restoration, certainly a big question in today's world. And then managing this kind of resource. So you'll see going from science into management and policy is what we're going to talk about. So science sediment innovations, starting again on that large scale of what's going on along our coastline. I think anyone who's lived through a few of our atmospheric rivers in the last couple of years will be familiar with what's been happening along our coast in terms of erosion and very turbulent times along our coast. But what is that's happening right now? We know it's happened in the past. What is it going to look like in the future? Well, we have some big challenges. A study a few years ago from a colleague at USGS, 2/3 of Southern California's beaches are not going to survive by 2100 without some sort of human intervention. There's been an updated study since then that expands that to along the whole coastline of California. Inside San Francisco Bay, there's a huge demand, 750 million cubic yards of sediment. There's actually a bigger range, goes up to maybe even 600 million cubic yards are needed to maintain what's currently there, not what's really hopeful in the future. Well, they say and slated for restoration, but that's assuming that there's not a sea level change. So a huge demand of sediment along the coastline, just in California. I just found this yesterday from someone sent this to me. These are beaches around the world. Take a minute to orient you, but these are the top 20 tourist beaches around the world predicted to shrink the most. So I'll use my cursor here so folks online can't see it. Anyway, so in Nigeria, there's a Landmark Beach is expected to lose a kilometer of its beach, half a mile of its beach gone by 2100. Now, that sounds like a lot, but think about the economics behind that. That's an entire system that's probably going to be the economic system that's going to be collapsing. These are all over the world. You have to get all the way down to number 17, 16, 15 over there to hit your first US beach. So this is not something that's just isolated in California or in Florida in the United States. This is a global problem that we are going to be losing our beach environments. Now, this is focused on tourism, but we know that beaches are more than just for people, and the environment is not just for us alone. Certainly, beach habitats for Sonali plovers, for grunion runs, would be lost. Offshore, gray whale feeding grounds are expected to be changing as our sediment supply alters through climate change. So habitat is also potentially to be lost. And then how many of you drove or walked on a sidewalk today? My gosh, 100% of you. Guess what? You all were touching sand. Sand is a key component of our entire infrastructure throughout the entire world. It's used in construction of freeways. It's used in construction of buildings. We're standing amongst sand right here. It's used in glass. It's used to brush your teeth. It's used in industrial solvents and processes that we never see again. So sand is a huge component of our modern life as well, not just beaches, not just habitats, but it's part of our world. So if sediment is so important, you'd think would be a great thing to manage wisely because that's what we do. Nope. So this cartoon, it's from a state work group from the past, showing some of the, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but just showing how we handle our sand shed or our sediment, our watersheds where sediment's moving through. All the reds are where sediment is removed from the system. So dams obviously stop sediment. There's mining that happens in rivers. There's urbanization where we lock everything in place. We've done a lot of channelization of our rivers, so there's a nice contrast of daylighting streams now that's happening in many urban environments. In Berkeley, for example, they've started to try and daylight streams to resupply the sediment, reconnect the sediment spaces that used to deliver to the bay. And then along the coast, we've done a lot of things, armoring, built groins and jetties, which we love because we can get out to the ocean on our boats to do our research, but they have an impact. But the point is, this treatment of our sand sheds and our sediment watersheds is not sustainable. Bigger picture, impacts from humans have going on for centuries. And this is a slide from a colleague at USGS who talks on geologic timescales much more than I do. But just looking back at the past few hundred years in California alone, what has changed with our landscape use? So pre-contact from Europeans, the environment was very different, as we well know. How it was managed and treated. Through the European settlement to the gold rush, we had a loss of native grasses. We then shifted into a lot of widespread barren lands as the environment was shifting. If anyone's seen tumbleweeds rolling around in any parts of California, not native to North America at all. Those are from Russia. So they've become part of our environment. I grew up in the desert where we battled tumbleweeds all the time, but I didn't know they were from Russia. So a lot of shifting to non-native types of plants later that really shifted the sediment delivery. We also had the gold rush with a lot of hydraulic mining, as well as different development in terms of agriculture and forest treatments up to today's world, which that previous slide kind of reflects the modern treatment of our system. So if you aren't motivated by now that we should try to understand sediment, maybe the next section, just like how curious and kind of things you can uncover with sediment, will help you along the way. So we're going to talk about coastal and marine sediment, and I apologize for any of you who are already deeply involved in sediment. Some of these slides might be a little basic, but it's always helpful, I find, to make sure we're all using the same language and the same definitions and working from the same point. So I love this hydrology here, these hydrodynamics. John, I think we could talk about that for a while, but I don't even understand what's happening there. So, why do we study sediment, especially in the ocean? It's certainly fantastic records, just like tree rings, just like ice cores. You learn so much from just looking at the layering of what's been raining down onto the seafloor. And this core right here is several meters long, sliced into pieces, and you can see through time different floods that have occurred from the different colors. The blackness showing high organic matter that's been breaking down. The lighter side closer to me is the freshest. The farthest is the deepest. So you can tell just a lot about what kind of biology has been in that area. This is how we know a lot about climate cycles. Obviously, another reason to study sediment is understanding our minerals, certainly oil and gas, but now a lot more interest about, well, it's been going on since the 70s, but now a lot closer, scarily, in my opinion, scarily, sorry, taking the NOAA hat off for a moment, of deep sea mining, seafloor mining. So understanding what's out there and how it got there is really important before we start doing things to it. Some of this might be one of those basic slides for us all, but just to kind of get in your minds what I'm going to talk about next. Just the size, when I say sediment, what I'm talking about. I'm talking about it all. I think there's a lot of default to think sediment means sand. Sediment means all of this. Boulders, cobbles, pebbles, they're really big sediments. Certainly have some argument with other folks about if those are truly sediment, but they lead to the coarse sands and the fine sands and then to the silts. And those two arrows up and down are just talking about the energy levels needed to either transport it, to liberate it from the seafloor, or to keep it once it's moving, once it's liberated, to keep it moving through the system. So obviously, high energy is needed to move boulders, low energy is needed to move the clays. So why I say every grain size counts, this is my new thing. I want a t-shirt that says this. Every grain size counts. And just some ideas of what this looks like. So cobbles, as I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, why cobbles have really become a huge interest in the coastal restoration and adaptation community. Certainly sand, and that's a great mixed beach there of sand and cobble and boulder. And then mud flats, this is here, this is in Richardson Bay in San Francisco. So all of these just images are what, as we go through the next few slides talking about transport and how these types of grain sizes move, will all come into our restoration challenges and solutions. So I'm going to go through each one of these. So cobble movement along the shore. This is from a very recent study. I'm not going to go through it and claim any credit whatsoever, but really just to kind of put in our minds how cobble can move. You focus on the very top closest. I'm only saying that for folks on Zoom. This list right here. This was the beginning of the experiment where they tagged 300 cobbles and then put them out there in November of 2020 and then tracked them with radio frequencies all the way through to January of 22. So a long period of time for the cobbles. And these are some of the different types, the shapes and sizes that they tagged to track. And what's really interesting to me about this is that it's not an on-off or up-down. Cobbles are circular in their movement, and you need a lot of energy to keep them moving around, and they also don't like to move a lot. We kind of, for a while, it takes them a while to kind of break down into some different patterns. Once they do break down, their pattern breaks down, then it's sort of a free-for-all. So when you think about what this might mean for a beach environment, there's a lot of implications about, is this a useful type of material to restore a beach or protect some infrastructure or change some habitats? So just as an indication of the physics behind cobble movement. Next, we'll go to sand. Sand, obviously, much finer, doesn't take as much energy. It also moves in a circular patterns, as you saw from those big swirls at the beginning of this chapter. But what I want you to think about is that there's a lot more that goes on that we don't see with sand, a lot more. There's these seasonal cycles of moving the sand onshore and offshore, so that's what these two pictures are showing, of a summer profile when we have the big, wide beaches, and then small waves, low supply coming from cliff erosion and rivers here in California at least. And then the winter when all that flips around and you have the bigger waves and you have bigger deposits pumping out and bigger erosion episodes. And so all that energy and supply moves that sand offshore, and it's just been a reservoir and sandbars. If you're a surfer, how many surfers are there? Okay. So to look for sandbars and read the waves based on that. So that's sand movement. The last thing I want to talk about is mud movement. So notice this is in the water, not on the seafloor and not on the beach itself. Mud is finicky. It's high maintenance. It doesn't like to settle. These pictures right here, these photos, are showing unflocculated in a water column. This is sitting or in a beaker in a lab. This is 15 hours. This is like this. If it's independent, if it's small, if it hasn't clumped together with other friends, it's not going to travel very quickly. It's going to stay in suspension until it's forced from either biology or from chemistry into clumps, into flocks. Once they become flocks, they can settle just as quickly as sand grains. So with this other photograph, this is adding something in 1 minute. It cleared the entire water column. This process is used in beer making. This is used in sewage treatment. This is used in a lot of different places to clear your water, to remove those fine particles that just don't want to settle. They take their time because they don't have to move down if they don't want to. I'm pretending like they're alive. But I spent a lot of time with mud, so they're friends. Contaminants and sediment. So I wanted to bring us into the geochemistry space a little bit more. First of all, sand is not a typical carrier of contaminants. So why is that? It's because with the clays, you have positively charged surface areas, and those are contaminants, sorry, negatively charged surface areas on clay particles that bind with the positively charged contaminants. So heavy metals, PCBs, DDT, all of these put in a situation, into the ocean, will have a positive charge that then binds with the muds. So once that happens, and the mud starts to incorporate it into flocks, you can, again, clear the water column, but now you have all these contaminants on the seafloor or on a deposited zone. So just this, keep in mind what this might, I will come back to what this means in a moment, but thinking about the implications of deposits of contaminated sediment when we want to use sediment. So now we're going to do a little transect across and do a little visitation along a few different environments. So from estuaries to beaches, a little bit offshore, and to the deep ocean. I'm just going to talk about what these environments from a sediment perspective look like. So incredibly simplified and yet complex cartoon of the environment of an estuary, where you've got muddy environments, you've got sandy environments. The reason why I bring this up is because salt marshes are a key component of our restoration goals in this world, and they rely heavily on mud. So mud is a valuable resource. Talk about beach morphology. You've kind of already seen the seasonal component, but just kind of refreshing your memory, the whole thing is the beach. All of this, from our dunes, which are very helpful in protecting infrastructure and supplying habitat, all the way to the outer surf zone, way offshore. All of this is the beach. So when we talk about beach restoration, it could be anywhere along this entire profile. John mentioned littoral zones, littoral cells. I certainly invested a lot of time in this and have a lot of strong opinions about littoral cells. But as John mentioned, just as a scientifically valid opinion. But just headlands, kind of bracketing a zone of sources and sinks within this area. Sources being from the rivers, from rivers and from cliffs and scarping, sinks being submarine canyons. Transport within this area, sort of in a box, would be your zone. But what's important to recognize, and this was the research that culminated in this graphic recently from last year, is that these are not hard and fast areas. They turn on and off. These headlands turn on and off depending on energy. And that too has implications for how we use sediment in beach restoration, how we use cobbles, how we use mud for marsh restoration. So nothing, as we all know, nothing is static in the ocean. Just because we've drawn some lines on a map doesn't mean that that's how it's going to be. So recognizing the dynamic nature of littoral boundaries is something that I think is slowly gaining some recognition in the restoration community. So I want to just flash this up for a moment and then go to the next slide quickly, just to kind of start moving us offshore here. So you can imagine the fine grain sediment, if it's flocculated, is going to, even if it's flocculated, it's going to travel a little bit farther than the coarser grain sands, which are going to deposit much closer to shore. So what does that look like in reality? What I'm going to point out here, this is some recent work that I've been doing with a colleague at the Greater Farallones Marine Sanctuary, looking at at the seafloor sediment components. So the darker browns here are high mud percentages. The white and the light tan are low mud percentages or high sand content. And all these 4,000 samples through here. A lot of sand in this zone down here near San Francisco Bay, but I also want to point out these mud belts right along here. And then a cleaner shelf no mud, and then on the slope and the rise, more mud again. So these mud belts are all dependent on energy, and this also has implications of what's being transported and deposited where. So certainly you can imagine near the Russian River, there's going to be a lot more mud coming out, so there's a high supply there. So there's a muddier zone there than down here near San Francisco Bay, where there's not a lot of mud coming out, and it's a different environment. A lot more complicated than those two simple things. But what I'm trying to do here is demonstrate there's just patterns throughout the seafloor, just like there are patterns along the beach, just like there's patterns along a marsh in an estuary. So sediment is dynamic, and so saying one thing is going to do this all, or one grain size is going to fix that problem, does not really reflect nature. So I'm going to take us off to the deep ocean now, and this is where I get to practice my pronunciation. So lithogenous sediments, these are the mostly terrestrial types. So these are the sands and muds that come from our land. The biogenous sediment types, these are the organism-based ones. Those are containing 30% more of the different types of biogenic origins. And the oozes, which I'm going to talk about gently. Hydrogenous sediments. These are ones from the hydrothermal vents on the seafloor primarily. And then these are some of the most fun ones, the cosmogenous sediments, things that come from outer space. And we're getting bombarded all the time, but it's such a small percentage, but hey, they're out there. The reason why I went through these types is to get to this slide, which is where we find all these different types of sediments on the seafloor. The reds are obviously close to shore, and the terrigenous types of sediment. And then the oozes are raining down all the time from all the biology that's going on in the ocean. I wanted to point this out because when you look at where the sediment's distributed, the different types are distributed, and what might be traveling with these different types of sediment, I want you to think about organic carbon. So the ocean has absorbed most of the carbon dioxide that we have put into the atmosphere. We know this. So where is that going? It's going to the seafloor in huge amounts. Large amounts is going to the seafloor. And we're just starting to get a sense of what that means. And these nodules right here are a target. These have rare earth elements that we all use, that we all need in these, and to drive our electric cars and to support our life as we try and go to a cleaner future. So there's resources there, but there's also phenomenal amounts of organic carbon locked up on the seafloor. There might be some conflict here in liberating some of that organic carbon while we do seafloor mining. So, okay, not to leave you on a dark moment, but let's just kind of put this off for now. We've traveled now from estuaries all the way offshore to the deep ocean. I'm going to bring us back on shore now and talk about some restoration using sediment. So for anybody who's touched a little bit on adaptations now and to sea level rise, you may have come across this green to gray spectrum. It comes across in many different ways in different cartoons, but essentially the meaning that if you're going to adapt to sea level rise in some way, you have a lot of options. Those options range from the greener side, because they're softer techniques, where you're doing more vegetated, dune restoration, all the way to our more traditional, which is what has happened for a long time, building, heavy duty building, groins, seawalls, revetments that don't really incorporate biology and natural cycles in them. And there's a range in between. Now, it doesn't mean that this approach will work everywhere. I don't think you'd want to have, the ports that we rely on are not going to want to have this throughout their whole area where they are moving billions of dollars of cargo around. Likewise, putting hard structures in places that would much rather, that are much more susceptible to, or we're willing to absorb biological habitat enhancements, also not the best fit. But the point, bigger question, your bigger point here is that most of these need sediment of some type, of any grain size. So that's why every grain size matters, or all grain size counts. Every grain size counts. So the next couple slides, they're going to be a little wordy. I'll just warn you of that, because I want to impress upon you the challenge and the complications of using sediment in restoration. Simply, we want these three components when we're using our raw materials: clean, compatible sediment, minimal biological impacts, and long-lasting placement. And so we think about, where is the sediment coming from and how does it match? We want to think about the potential effects on the species of the area and the habitats more broadly. And then we want to think about the dynamics of the systems. So what's the transport, and how certain are we that these placements are going to actually address the erosion concerns? There's a lot of people and agencies that will be involved in kind of restoration work. This next slide is just a snapshot of what, on the federal side, what it looks like and what's driving it. So on the top levels, we've got the Sanctuaries Act that's protecting our oceans. We've got the Clean Water Act that's protecting all of our waters. We have NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the broader environmental component. I would add on there now, we should probably add the National Historic Preservation Act for considering cultural and historic elements within a system. You've got the agencies, the Army Corps of Engineers and EPA, that are paired up and responsible for implementing all of this, these activities, and then you bring it down into the local level and to the state level. So everyone, you can see, there's a lot involved in just moving some sediment from one place to another. This is the wordiest slide I have, I promise. I'm not reading this to you, other than to say that deep down on this list, right here in blue, we finally get to chemical, physical testing and biological testing if needed. But there's a lot of beginnings, a lot of steps to go through, really important steps to identify that clean and compatible sediment, where you're satisfying all of these needs of the region and of where the sediment's coming from, where it's going, how you're going to get it there. On the second step, the minimal biological impacts, certainly if you place a whole bunch of material someplace, there's going to be smothering. We think about, so an argument that goes back and forth against doing these kinds of nourishment placements or sediment placements or rock placements, the argument goes back and forth, well, the features are never going to come back, or how long is it going to take for them to come back? Well, we have floods, and we have huge deliveries of sediment from rivers during atmospheric rivers. From water rivers, from atmospheric rivers. So they come back then. Systems do adapt. Biology can adapt. So timing it is important. And then obviously changing something from a muddy environment to a sandy environment or other directions would also cause a shift in the habitat and the biology that lives there. Those are considerations. And then the last piece I mentioned is the long-lasting placement. Now you've seen this graphic already of the sandbars moving on and offshore, but that's just in a typical year. We also got longer-term things to consider about erosion rates, long-term erosion rates, climatic events such as ENSO, and then how you're doing it will also play into how long it will last. How big is it? How frequent are you going to go back? Are you going to go back every 5 years, every 10 years? Do you have resources to think about all that? So that gets to a later part of my talk about managing all of this. So I just have a few examples of what all these things look like. So going through again, that every grain size counts. So cobble berms and dynamic revetments. This graphic over here, if you look at that first, here's a sandy dune, and here is the cobbles. So these dynamic revetments, what looks like a whole bunch of rock dumped on the beach, is meant to simulate or duplicate, mimic, however you want to refer to it, the natural shingle beaches that are around that we find on our coast. This happens to be up in Washington, but it's not unheard of to find cobble underneath sand. And in fact, in some places in California, we're doing more of those types of experiments. Ventura is one example. Surfers Point, look it up if you're interested. A lot of fascinating science and engineering has gone into that one spot to better understand how cobbles can be underpinning a beach. So I've mentioned beach nourishment a few times. There's a few examples what this looks like, but basically it's putting sand somewhere in the vicinity of a beach, either directly on the beach, a little offshore of the beach, so the waves can feed it. There's a few different methods you can use. And it can, obviously, when you show up to a beach that's been nourished, like, wow, that's a big, beautiful beach. It costs a lot of money. That's $28 million for 1.5 million cubic yards. If we go back in your mind that San Francisco Bay needs 450 million cubic yards, there's a lot of zeros that we need to add here. That's not going to work. And then this last little thing, this was what drove my dissertation work here, was that I want to understand how headlands could be part of solutions, so that we do a better investment of where we place our sediment, or place our sand in particular, because the public will show up and say, where'd our beach go? Well, you put it in the wrong place. It wasn't the right location. You put it in a really active zone where there wasn't protection, and now you're upset, rightfully so. So maybe we could do better. We could use science in a way that supports better investments of our public money. One example of that is in Ocean Beach. This is a project that is 2 years on now, or 2 years old at this point. And just a couple of words about it. The main ship channel coming into San Francisco Bay is dredged by the Army Corps. They used to deposit all of it in SF8, which is just the designation of the dredge deposit zone. And in 2021, shifted it to this area right here, the Ocean Beach, I forget what the D is for, study. I think it's deposit study. Pushing it right within the waves to let the waves then move that sand all along the beach. It's been a raging success, and it's a much better use of the sand that's being dredged and keeping it in the system and feeding the beach naturally, instead of having to move sand up and down by trucks, which had been going on from the north part of Ocean Beach to the south part. So a great example of how beach nourishment, when done right, can be incredibly powerful. There's a lot of examples where it doesn't work. That's a whole other talk. Then moving into marshes, this is a complicated slide. I think the most important thing I'd want you to take away from it is that thin layer sediment placement is a thing, and it means spraying mud over a marsh to simulate deposits of mud coming over a long period of geologic time, but accelerating that to be quicker, more on a human time scale, because we don't have geologic time on our side anymore. To keep these marsh plains elevating and growing at the same rate or faster than sea level rise. So one demonstration of this is down in Orange County. This is the Seal Beach Wildlife Refuge in Orange County, where there was sediment, I'll just go through my slide, in Huntington Harbor, a mix of sand and mud that was then parsed out into the mud, went to the wetlands, and the sand went to the beaches, and this is what it looks like. They basically, and this was a huge experiment trying to figure out how to do this. It looks super simple, but they broke so many things, and they had to design so many times over and over again. So the science behind it might be simple, the engineering and the implementation of it is a whole other chapter. So this is often held up as one of California's first TLP, thin layer placement demonstrations. Look at this for a very long time, apparently. Good? There we go. Okay. So, so what can we do about our sediment? broadly, and this is just my last couple slides. So this is what I'm going to get into managing coastal sediment. And I absolutely had to put something about Bodega because it doesn't get dredged very often. It gets dredged every 12 years or so. Not a lot of sediment comes out from here, from our bay, from the harbor, I mean. But our whole region certainly has sediment type of issues. So, regional sediment management. This puzzle right here has all kinds of words in it that hopefully would resonate with some of you. There's research-based in here. There's research with identifying problems, defining the causes, providing solid scientific frameworks. Then there's social elements of this, finding a collaborative approach amongst agencies, addressing problems on regional scales. There's engineering and permitting. There's finding a programmatic roadmap, establishing streamlined processes, and the engineering, figuring out new tools and analytical ways of doing things. All of these pieces together create a much more comprehensive and inclusive way of doing sediment management along our coast. Now, who does that? A lot of people. You've already got a sense of from that earlier slide of at least the Army Corps and EPA. I'm not going to read the alphabet soup here necessarily, but a lot of players come into participating in these conversations. Down at the bottom is probably an undersold part of this. This is where we all get jobs someday, right? Up in these government areas. This is where people are coming together and saying, I have my house falling into the ocean. What are you going to do about it? Or our road that we rely on, the only way in and out of here is crumbling. What are you going to do about it? So very important input from the public to our science that we use. I've kind of gave a sense of this with that green to gray slide. All I want to point out here is that certainly a lot of tools in our toolbox to do sediment management on the technical side. They all have their issues, and none of them are a one-size-fits-all silver bullet. But rather than read a list, I thought I'd share with you a few images of what sediment management really looks like. So first one is removing obsolete dams. This is Matilija Dam down in Southern California. A little bit closer to us, Carmel River Dam was removed 7 years ago now. The whole environment nearby has come back to life because that sediment is now flowing freely down to the coast. If you're following the news, the Klamath is being freed. That's a hugely exciting for so many different reasons on the cultural side. Certainly on an ecological side, the environment along the Klamath coastline is going to change radically. So removing old dams. Realignment of infrastructure. Anyone that's driven north from here along Gleason's Beach, you'd recognize this. This was an image I found online. This is where the new bridge and where the new road is, basically where the new Highway 1 is. It's an old photo. But getting the infrastructure out of the way so natural processes can continue at the pace that they're not threatening our life. The natural processes are going to continue. And the last thing is just moving sediment physically, transporting it around in trapped areas, around harbor mouths, and feeding it along to the beaches here. So these are a few different ways that we are actively doing sediment management. Okay, my last slides. So the science is set to management because I think, as John said, I've had this interest in a long time for applied science. I spoke with one of your colleagues a little while ago about this, but applying science is something that I've always been interested in, and getting to the management part is key. So some examples of where this is going on, down in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties, Beacon, which that's what the acronym up there, Beach Erosion Authority for Clean Oceans and Nourishment. We've built an entire sediment management program and guided by science, involving a lot of the agencies and local partners. And we have a research agenda which constantly is asking the managers of the region, what do you need to know? What are your decisions that you're challenged by? How can we then go back as scientists and think about, well, they were talking about this, and we're really good at that. So why don't we work on that part? Or we don't know how to do that. This is a new growth area for us. Just off our coastline, driven by the Greater Farallones and now Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuary, the North Central Coast Sediment Coordination Committee. I have to admit, I did come up with that name. It's a really bad name. But all that aside, managing sediment along the entire coastline from Sonoma County all the way down to San Mateo County, bringing together dozens of agencies to talk about how are we going to manage our really restricted resources that we have, that we need to do the restoration that we want to supply or to stimulate and enhance our coastal habitats, as well as protect our infrastructure. And then last, inside San Francisco Bay, BCDC, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, so the equivalent of the Coastal Commission on our outer coast, BCDC inside San Francisco Bay. They have been working really hard on sediment for a long, long time, and we do a lot of sand mining in San Francisco Bay. So balancing the needs of the environment with the needs of humanity, that's something that they've been working with for a long time. So what do you see now? Zooming back out, you know, I took you on a little bit of a tour of sediment, got a little muddy, and I really enjoy talking about this, but for each one of you, you all have something that hopefully you see a little differently from these satellite images, from whatever perspective that you're engaged in your research. And my closing thoughts, first of all, there's a QR code for those of you who like them. I would highly recommend you pull it up because every grain size counts for a sustainable future. I hope you've heard me say that enough time. I'll sell t-shirts outside later. Secondly, that we do need our sediment. You'll hear conversations in communities about how sediment is a bad thing for salmon. And we have muddy waters. That's a very different conversation to have. We have polluted sediment. That's a different conversation to have as part of this, or that's a different topic within this bigger component of we need our sediment for our lifestyles and for habitats to survive. And last, help us learn about California's sand. If you've hit this QR code, you'll be taken to an Army Corps website. It's a tool that you put a quarter or any American coin, it is American coins, only on the beach. You take a picture, upload it to the web, and it will size it using algorithms, and boom, you've now added to the database of sediment science along California's coast. You'll hear more about it because we continue to try and do statewide campaigns around this to draw in more community science and more awareness of the issues around sediment along our coastline. And that is all that I have. I appreciate your attention, and thank you very much for having me. That's Point Dume. Yeah, that's Point Dume right there. That's an old picture. My beard's a little different color now.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Doug. Excellent. Appreciate that, all that information. We have some questions for Doug. Let the Zoom people hear you. Yeah.
Okay, great. How good of an idea do we have of sediment transport rates along the coast of pre-industrialization? How well are we able to look at different impacts of let's say ranching, maybe bring up sediment for building, sediment?
Yep, great question. The rates of sedimentation offshore is how we can see how sediment has deposition has changed. So by taking cores, we can see if there was a specific flood period, or we can see if there was a period or flood year, or we can see if there was just a long period of abrupt shifting in the amount of sediment, the grain sizes, the biology that was also within the spaces. So just the deposition alone can tell us that rate of change. You're talking about, so that's the first part. You're talking about the transport. So are you suggesting about like the physics of the movement of the sediment? Okay. So the piece what comes to mind is that we have long records now showing how wave environments have changed and are changing. There's some records going back now 100 years based on some really cool research using earthquake and wave. Anyway, there's some really cool research. It goes back over 100 years showing us how the wave environment has been changing. That we could spin forward into a model using in modeling, and we'd be able to tell how those transport rates have evolved and changed in combination with the deposition rate. So we know what was there when, as the grain sizes have changed. So a specific example, San Pablo Bay and Suisun Bay in San Francisco Bay, the bigger bay, were not the shallow, muddy things that they are now. That was from the gold rush. So that happened in a relatively quick period. You could take a core through all that sediment, and you could get down below that, and you could see the difference in the bay environment before the gold rush and the hydraulic mining shifted the grain sizes. So that's just an example of the kind of work that you could do anywhere along the coast and understand in connection with this modeling work about the wave environment changing. You could pull it out that way. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a really great talk. I'm not sure, I know very little about settlement, but I am very curious about sort of sediment sand loss on beaches that moves like terrestrially. Because I feel like when I walk around a lot of beaches like Ocean Beach or Dillon Beach nearby, I see a lot of sand that's like blown onto the street, blown onto the parking lot. And I'm wondering if that's like a significant source of transport away from beach or sand loss when people are working towards.
Absolutely. So part of a littoral cell includes aeolian transport. And it's usually thought of as a loss to the system. Dunes do can also supply sand back into the system. You know, think about Bodega Dunes. If the plants are ever removed, it will be much more active in supplying sand back into the system. But it is far and away included as a sink in littoral cells. Certainly once it moves up onto where humans are involved and it's in our way, then it gets moved around, and Ocean Beach, they're trucking it down from, like I said, from the north to the south part of the beach. But just sticking with San Francisco for a moment, you know, all of the west side of San Francisco that's now hardened is all sand dunes. All of that is sand. And so all of that was blowing in from the ocean and leaving the ocean environment and just piling up on land. So it is a significant part of the overall system. And I think it's been wise for us to try and not just truck it away out of the system now and changing the perspective. Like this is in our way, we need to get rid of it. This is part of the system. I mean, it happens at Ocean Beach certainly is national park, so that they have a different perspective than an industrial area. But aeolian transport is a big portion of littoral cells and loss to the system. Great question. I didn't talk about aeolian very much.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I was curious about the approach of moving the dredged material from the Golden Gate to Ocean Beach. And you mentioned the need for clean and compatible sediments. I was wondering if people had looked at, I could imagine there could be a lot of pollutants in sediments coming out of San Francisco Bay. And has anyone looked at that? Is that a concern that you're moving dredged soils from the bay to Ocean Beach?
Absolutely. Any sediment that's moved and used in any restoration work is tested. I kind of went through that one really wordy slide and just got to the chemical and physical testing. So right off the bat, if there's hot sediment, then it's taken out of consideration and not used in any kind of work. It is taken off offshore and deposited in really, really deep disposal areas, or if it's really, really bad, they take it inland and they landfill it. So it's taken out of the system entirely. So any of those activities that you saw, that sediment was tested, it was determined that it was clean and compatible for that area. And just the proximity between SFA, or between the dredge channel and the main shipping channel and Ocean Beach, just it matches. That beach is made of that same sediment. So it wasn't a stretch to put it there. But the contamination of sediment coming out of San Francisco Bay really would be on the fine sediment, which would be much more suspended and in the plumes, more likely, than the sediment that's deposited deep, deep down, 300 feet. You have to make it through that 300-foot hole right at the mouth of the Golden Gate. So that sand it's mostly sand. It's pretty clean to begin with, and then any testing would identify anything else with it.
Thanks, Jeff. I actually I'm not in this field at all, so I don't really know if this is done, but after having been here for a couple of months, I've been wondering about tsunami effects on sediment. Have they done that in California? Tsunamis on sediment?
Yes. The USGS has looked at that. There's a few people that, in the Santa Cruz office, the marine hazards office there. I forget what their name is now. It's Pacific and Marine Science Center. And they would be much better to talk to about that. But if your question is like, what do the tsunamis do to the sediment in harbors? Is that? Yeah. Certainly with the amount of turbulence and current speeds that tsunamis would generate, especially in those enclosed areas, everything gets churned up. And when you're thinking about a harbor, just to the previous question, contaminated sediment liberated, once it gets oxidized, now you've got really messy water, really dirty water, and now it's moving around everywhere. So the impacts on the biology are probably much more severe in localized than kind of more broadly after a tsunami comes through. Geologically, I'd have to kind of punt on that one, unfortunately. It's not a space that I'm really up to speed on. But I appreciate the question.
Hi, Doug. Thanks.
Hi there.
This was a great talk. I have a million questions, but I'll try to keep it to one today and maybe follow up with it. But you showed a picture of Richardson Bay, and was that your ramp?
Yes.
Are you familiar with that project? I'm curious. I worked on that agency. So I'm wondering how that
So this is a restoration in a portion of Richardson Bay that Audubon was involved in, and there's a long story to it. And it's holding up well. It's a mixed sediment approach, and as well as some additional texture on the surface of the island there in terms of woody, wood structure, and we haven't had too challenging of an environment recently. We had the atmospheric storms last winter, but it's not an area that, well, from my perspective working on the coast, it's not a very challenging environment. Or once you kind of get things going, they will go pretty well in that space. It's got a nice mix of salt and water and fresh water. So some areas, some seagrass, eelgrass areas of restoration that are closer to the delta got hammered because they got so much fresh water, they just couldn't make it. That's not the issue with Richardson Bay because it's so much closer to the gate that more salt water does come in, and so there's good mixing there. So the plants have been reestablishing well. There's still lessons to be learned, of course, but I'd say it's coming along nicely. That's very scientific.
I'm excited South Africa went.
I was gonna say something about that. I was gonna say something.
Hi, Doug. Great talk. Love to hear about sediment. I don't know a lot about sediment in general, but I just had a question. I was thinking about like Moss Landing and Monterey and how you have those farms right off the coast and you have all that contaminant kind of flushing into the ocean. I just was wondering if there was any studies about implementing sort of sediment to create more sinks for all the nitrogen and purification processes, and if people have looked into that at all.
Fantastic question, and I love the broader thinking there. Certainly mitigation for agricultural runoff is a big deal. And because the Salinas Valley does generate so much runoff in that area alone. So there are a lot of studies done from like a Clean Water Act perspective, nitrogen runoff perspectives. There's a lot of work that has gone into tracking that and the levels of the different, nitrogen, phosphorus, all of these. You can see, you can go online and you can see a lot of the studies of all that. In terms of the role that sediment would be playing in that, or what could be done, the idea of buffers is, and making buffer zones is something that I think has been talked about with some of the agricultural communities. That would absolutely help in basically slowing the water down and letting it settle out. So constructed wetlands, kind of stilling ponds, all of those kind of concepts are in play, are in conversation, because anything that's done on land is much easier than dealing with things out in the ocean, or just treating the ocean as a dumping ground, which is more traditional. Is no longer really acceptable because you have the marine sanctuary right there. So, so to the sediment part of that, any of those kind of stilling zones, the buffer zones, that constructed wetland zones would encourage that settling out with the sediment and carrying those chemical compounds and nutrients down into the into the floor of that area. So it goes on. I don't know numbers of I can give you a stronger answer than that, but it's something that people do know about and think about and use.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I think we should probably wrap it up. There are lots. I have a lot more questions. Yeah, but many questions as an interesting research topics, and I really appreciate you connecting across the disciplines, as we say. Thanks again.
Thank you.